Section, hence why we are here. I think that's the main points I wanted to cover, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I don't know if you want all the process.
Okay, thank you. If I could just highlight some key issues, and there's going to be a little bit of duplication upon what Stuart said. The building of the Tetra Pak building has been flagged to council at least in two statement of intents, 2015 and 2016. The funding of the Tetra Pak building has always been confined to security over Whipple's assets itself. There's no underwrite or guarantee from the City Council. There has been some cloudiness over whether or not this transaction was in fact a major transaction as the law defines it. As Stuart said, there are two thresholds. One is the Companies Act, which the Tetra Pak transaction did not breach or did not rise to, but the agreement in our shareholders agreement between the City Council and Whipple, it does breach or rise to that level. Hence, we were only alerted of that about a week ago. We went through a couple of processes. One was asking our own democracy team, and they said, no, this is a major transaction. Hence the need for some degree of urgency in terms of getting this thing approved as a major transaction, which is a formal process which has to be, which the CCO committee can't do, which the council has to do. That's why we've had the urgency. That's why some of this paperwork is a little bit informal. But that's the start and end of it, I think. But I understand at least Dave and Martin have expressed concerns over the process, and I can understand why you'd be concerned. So happy to take questions.
Question. I requested that all correspondence between the Waikato Innovation Park Limited Board and the Hamilton City Council with reference to the funding arrangements for the construction of a new building on their campus be circulated, and any external advice, e.g. from the City Solicitor, received by Council concerning this matter. Now, so we've got a series, as I understand it, of, thank you for the Chair's summary, that's good, helpful. We've got a series of an email trail which I want to sort of come back to, but I'm just thinking, was there any correspondence from Tompkins Wake from our City Solicitor on this matter, written in writing?
If I could answer that, Mr. Chair, no, we didn't go to our legal advisors for an opinion on this matter.
Why not?
Well, sorry, point of order here. I thought we just had in the report comment that there was legal advice, and that's why it came here. I know you said from the democracy team, but when the report we had earlier,
the confusion is there are two entities we're talking about. Whipple, Waikato Innovation Park, has taken legal advice, okay, formal legal advice. I think Martin's question was to Sean, as in the City Council having taken legal advice, and I'm pretty sure it's further complicated by whether that's the same law firm. But yeah, so the advice we took was through our democracy team, and to be honest, it was a pretty black and white issue. It says, you know, our shareholders agreement says 25%. Brendan said, yep, this breaches 25%. So it didn't. I don't think it needed council to spend extra money to go to the legal advice.
No, okay. Well, I will ask the question after Mark has finished about why our firm gave different legal advice to the company we're involved in.
So, what was there a written to WIPL? There's presumably written legal advice from Tompkins Wake to the company.
As part of our signing off for our board, we get a certificate from Tompkins Wake for all the board meeting, and Tompkins Wake raised that matter during that process. And
was that was in writing? There was a written.
Yes. it
And
was.
all right, so it was a correspondence to the company, not the council,
That's
get
right,
that.
the company.
What did it say?
Well, it set out basically it copied what was in the shareholders' agreement, which said this 25% factor, and therefore you need approval of the Hamilton City Council.
And what was the date of that correspondence?
I can't recall off the top of my head, but it'll be just before our board meeting, so we're only talking a week and a half to 2 weeks ago, max.
What, mid-June?
I'd have to go back, and I don't have the date of that.
Okay.
But as soon as I was aware of that, I rang Sean to advise him that we'd discovered this issue.
But in terms of this approval, the correspondence, I requested, has been circulated to all councillors from Sean to the chair of the CCO, dated the 29th of June. Councillor Mannett, thank you for your email back. In my view, the answers to your questions 1, 2 and 3 are all yes, and therefore I believe an extraordinary meeting on this matter is not necessary. Rather, I can respond to the paper from WIPL stating that their request for a resolution as put has already been catered to by way of the prior approval of the statement of intent, which was presumably in the April CCO meeting. So Sean, what led you to believe that course of action was applicable?
Look, that was the opinion that I had. I looked at the documentation, I looked at the statement of intent and the words that were written in the statement of intent with regards to the build program and the transaction and so forth. However, and that was my view at the time. However, we were still waiting for the view from Democracy Services, which came through, which was contrary to my
Were
opinion.
you not aware on the 29th of June there had been advice from Tompkins Wakes to WIPL?
Yes, I was aware of that advice. However, I was looking at what we had already received, but I was clearly wrong.
But all I'm saying is, what was the advice as you understood it from their solicitors at the time?
That a resolution of council was required.
Right. Were you surprised that Democracy, not the city solicitor, the committee secretary to the CCO, Brendan, then advised you and the chair that in fact a resolution was necessary, as per his email on the 30th of June?
Yes, I was a little surprised, but I totally accepted the view.
Oh, sorry, thank you.
Do you think it's unusual, and perhaps this is a question to the Chief Executive, that in this case it would have been an expectation that we would not have had the good fortune to have Brendan Stringer give this advice, that advice would have been available, not relying on city democracy, on the democracy, compliments to Jude and her team, but basically with respect to you and your team and the Chief Executive?
We did seek the advice. I must say, we did seek the advice from others, so I wasn't just restricting it to my own opinion.
Can you confirm that?
Martin, can I just confirm
Sure.
that you're aware that the email that I sent to Sean,
Yep.
my 29th of June email, 10:39, asked a set of questions, and then I said, if this happens, then what do you think? That was deliberately sent to Democracy at the same time. So I was asking advice from Sean and Democracy. I said if the answer to these things is yes, then it probably doesn't rise to a major transaction. Sean said, yeah, basically I think you're right, Councillor Mallett, but Democracy came back and said, no, it is. So I'm not too sure.
No, to your credit, you second checked it, absolutely. To your credit,
so I'm not too
as
sure if
chair
there's
of
a
the
transgression
CCO.
there.
The only
You're
other
just asking
question,
advice. Sorry.
when the statement of intent was approved on April the 22nd, can you confirm that only 3 councillors in closed session were present for the approval of that statement of intent? As we're aware that the councillors such as myself have no role whatsoever in the approval of that statement of intent. It's delegated to the CCO committee.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
It was an open.
It was open?
It was an open, and that is a delegation that the CCO has. So that's exactly what. I've got the CCO terms of reference here. Consider, so terms of reference, point 5, consider and approve statements of intent as prepared by the board of each CCO. So that is firmly within our terms of reference.
I'm not questioning that.
Okay.
I'm certainly questioning that delegation in terms of, I believe this should have come back to the full council. I think it's a matter for debate, not for today.
Okay.
I firmly believe that issues of statement of intent ultimately should be ticked off as a check and a balance, and I'm not questioning the very good work of the CCO, I hasten to add.
Thank you, Mark. David.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. I would like the General Manager to explain why, when he wrote to you on the 29th of June, he didn't, as well as I'm perfectly entitled for him to express his own viewpoint, why he didn't also tell you of the legal opinion that Tompkins Wake had given Whipple that he has said today that he was aware of, which was different from his viewpoint. I don't understand why that wasn't, why you weren't informed of that, and thank goodness you did seek an extra opinion, but I would like an explanation of that through you, Mr. Chair.
If I may, my recollection is that the email that I sent through to Councillor Mallett actually had the document from Waikato Innovation Park attached, which made it quite clear that it had the advice from Tompkins Wake. However, I guess I was looking at it and, as I said before, had the view at the time, which I no longer hold, that given the fact that the matter was documented through the statement of intent and resolved to be agreed and approved, that was a suitable enough resolution, but clearly that's not the case.
Dave, just to help you, I'm just to be clear, because Sean just used the word "that document." I think the document he's talking about is the Waikato Innovation Park Bank Funding Approval of Tetra Pak Building, 18 June 2015.
That's correct.
And the last paragraph of that says Whipple shareholders are required to approve major transactions. Major transactions include the incurring of liabilities more than 25% of value of net assets. The contract has been reviewed by Tompkins Wakes, who are legal advisors to Whipple and HCC. So members of the committee, that's the document we're talking about there.
Yes, it's very hard to see from the emails we've got, which were not the original emails but have been copied into a Word and PDF document. It doesn't say what attachments were with them.
Yeah.
It only shows the email and who it went to.
Yeah, it is difficult, correct.
Yeah. So perhaps if we ask for documents, it'd be better to have the originals, because that's one thing you can tell.
I think what went out to people did include that document. It might not have been clear that it was an attachment to the email that Sean sent me.
Well, there's a whole email trail here, and there's we can't tell what attachments went with what at the time. In all my time on council, I haven't been aware of us being not informed of a legal opinion that was contrary to staff views. That would seem to me, through you, Mr. Chair, extremely important that we are notified of something like that, especially since it's also our own legal firm, and we would have some trust in their opinion, I guess. Otherwise we wouldn't be employing them. The other point I'd like to test the General Manager on, I guess, is the statement of intent. He has said that I think both today and in his email of the 29th, that I'm probably paraphrasing it slightly here, regards the statement of intent approval as therefore giving approval, or he did regard at that time, therefore giving approval to this transaction to go ahead. But in Brendan Stringer's email, he makes the point that the statement of intent, I read this morning, was not even so it was made before the transaction issue came up, the statement of intent approval by the CCO committee. Is that correct, my understanding?
The statement of intent was approved at the 22nd of April 2015 CCO committee meeting. The request for the bank funding came to us on the 18th of June, I think. I'm pretty sure, yep.
Yeah, so
So does that, I think that answers, yes. So
the words of Brendan here, Mr Chair, says at the time of the 22nd of April meeting, when the statement of intent was approved by the CCO committee, the funding arrangements did not appear to be on the table and therefore could not have been discussed or approved at that time.
If the statement, the actual Whipple statement of intent, the 2016 one, does include documentation about the loan, the cost of the build, the process, you know, the how far they were through the build. So that had been before the CCO.
But not the request for a new
The issue was whether when it was identified as a major transaction, I think, is the issue we're after. So no, it wasn't identified as a major transaction in the SOI statement of intent. I don't.
So the CCO committee couldn't have known that it needed to do something about it, I guess, because it wasn't identified to them.
It wasn't identified. It wasn't overtly identified as a major transaction in that statement of intent. I think I'm right in saying that. Yeah.
Mr Chair, if I can just clarify, the normal process for any statement of intent is the statement of intent would be approved, and then if there was a major transaction approval, that would be a separate recommendation at the same time, if it had been available at that time.
Correct.
In this case, it wasn't. Therefore, it was picked up later, and it came through as a separate transaction.
Okay, so through you then, Mr Chair, what steps are we taking in future to make sure we get these legal issues right in the companies that we have shareholdings or otherwise have an interest in?
A to-do list. Make sure you check there are no major transactions involved, I guess.
Well, it's also, in my experience with this part of council, to do with some historical documents, and that's the shareholders agreement was a historical document. There's been historical documents concerning property that have been discovered by third parties, like this one partly was. So I have a concern that, and maybe that's through you to the CEO, I have a concern that full due diligence in our own records is not happening all the time.
Like I said, there is just a bit of, there is that cloudy issue of the difference between major transactions per the Companies Act versus their shareholders. And that's not an excuse, but it is a reason that possibly this wasn't flagged as soon as it could have been.
Yeah, I just would expect that our staff were all over something like that and would draw to your attention. I don't have any problem with the transaction itself and the loan, and I'm not arguing it's that, it's the process on this particular item and some other items. It's not the first time in my experience in recent times in council that we haven't been given all the information up front so we can make a fully informed decision. I don't know whether the CEO would like to comment on that, or if I could ask you through him for a comment on what I've just said. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor McPherson. Through you, Mr Chair. This is not... the process behind this requires, you're right, a degree of understanding of what's in the shareholder agreement by both ourselves and by the shareholder as well, because in some cases they're having discussions that we're not privy to until such time as we meet with them. So they need to be aware that certain transactions and criteria will trigger aspects of the shareholder agreement. It's the same approach we also have with the airport. Within the airport's shareholders agreement, the airport deed, it's slightly different. There is a criteria there which sets a major transaction level, which is again different to the Companies Act definition. It requires a degree of responsibility. In that case, the airport has in place their own internal check mechanisms and so forth. They run that. Would expect also that Whipple will do that. But also at the same time, when our staff meet with our subsidiaries and have discussions about what's on the horizon, they should also be aware of what's in those contracts and those agreements to ensure they remind our companies that we have shareholdings in that there is a process that council must follow. So it's a reasonable expectation to have of staff, and I'll ensure that staff are aware of that responsibility.
Thank you. Just before I go to Margaret and then Mark,
I just had one last one. Would it not be wise then to set up a sort of a matrix record of all of the interests we have in that nature, property and companies, and some checklist or that could be at a quick glance referred to, including by elected members if necessary?
One of the reasons that this fell through the cracks as well, there's a position in the finance team that was responsible for effectively managing the administration aspects of our CCOs, our council-controlled organisations, and the person that's responsible for that role has resigned and moved on to another role and has yet to be replaced. So there's a degree of making sure, and it comes back to previous challenges I had about the depth of resilience in the teams to ensure there's someone that has the knowledge. But I do agree there needs to be some standard operating procedures documented to ensure that this is captured. I think if that staff member was in that role, this wouldn't have been overlooked, because that role requires a degree of preciseness of timelines and so forth to ensure that the right meetings have had. So we'll take that on board, and I'll work with the CFO to ensure that's captured.
Thank you.
I just will remind you that the company did advise us in that notification of the 18th of June. Margaret.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. Perhaps the first one through you, Chair, to the CEO. Interested in the questioning that Councillor Gallagher was travelling, the path that he was travelling down, about delegations. Who signs off delegations?
The council as a whole, I think. We set up, don't we, at the start of every term, we go through the...
Under the new legislation, it was a mayoral proclamation, and until such time as the council changes that, that's the legal status as I understand it.
Mr Chairman, I can clarify. The Mayor established the committees and appointed the chair people to those committees. Council signed off on the delegations.
Thank you. That was my understanding as well. I just want a little bit of clarity here. I'm not too sure, and perhaps, Chair, if you could help, who made the decision to regarding the legal advice from Council on whether this was a major transaction, met the major transaction threshold or not?
I asked advice from,
right.
I asked advice from Sean and Democracy.
And who made the decision then?
The accurate decision came from Democracy. Both Sean and I had a call on it, but we both knew that we better check with these guys, and
Yes.
so Brendan gave us the final advice. Yes, which
That was the
agreed to
final
agree.
advice, but the
Pardon?
actual that's the final advice. I mean, my understanding is that staff members can't actually make decisions. They give advice, but they don't make decisions. So, who actually made the decision about whether we should proceed with this course of action? or not?
So as soon as we got advice from Democracy that it triggered the major transaction,
Yes.
Sean and I set about quickly we've got to get because these guys need the money. We'll need the loan. We better get this approved as quick as we can. So hence the rushed nature of this meeting here.
So the decision was made by yourself and the GM.
Rob Pascoe and I discussed it, and we brought Sean into the discussion.
Okay,
to
not by the
Brendan,
democracy manager. I mean, because that was
Yeah.
my understanding that
Yeah.
we've singled out Brendan as he's the person that's made the decision. Well, that's
Oh no,
not
he
my
gave
understanding.
us the
Gave us the
advice,
advice.
and we acted. And our reaction to that advice was we need to call a meeting to get this thing.
Thank you. I just wanted to make that
Yep.
clear. Thank you. That was all I had.
Okay, thank you, Martin.
The CEO, can you confirm that until such time as the committee secretary to the CCO, Brendan Stringer, gave that advice,
I don't think Brendan's actually the committee secretary.
committee,
We are in a stage of flux. I'm not too sure who the committee secretary of the CCO is, because we haven't had one for a long time. but-
Brendan's role?
We're a few gaps in our staff.
What is Brendan's job description?
Brendan's a democracy advisor. He's a committee advisor.
So is it fair to say it was really good luck that you CC'd the democracy advisor, committee advisor on this, because he then gave you a contrary view?
Good judgment.
Good judgment. Yes. To the chief executive, do you think that's an ideal state of affairs?
It's not luck.
To be fair, I'm currently working with the democracy manager in terms of how we better manage our legal contract. The democracy team actually has some very well qualified lawyers in their team, and it is entirely appropriate that we leverage the skill set they do have to ensure that some of these more black and white transparent decisions, we do that. They are well aware though, because we initially had the advice from Tompkins Wake, in this case there's a degree of, hey, does this make sense question to this respect, and that's what response came back. They are aware though on the more complex matters that we use Tompkins Wake. They are our council solicitors. So if we had some vagaries around the scenario, if there was some uncertainty around the scenario, we would have contacted Tompkins Wake and got their advice. However, in this circumstance, it was very black and white. It's almost a mathematical equation. If you take the balance sheet, multiply it by a percentage, is the transaction above or below that percentage, and that's effectively what was done, and proven that maths worked and supported the view held by Tompkins Wake, not that we're second guessing them, that it was a major transaction per the shareholder agreement.
Okay, follow-up question. Compliments to the democracy team, absolutely, for having good maths. I'm not sure if the rest of us have good maths, because today we're being asked to approve a funding transaction. It's got a sense of a minute to midnight parliamentary retrospective legislation rush through urgency about it. But can you tell me, in an ideal scenario as a learning, when should this matter ideally have been referred to the Finance Committee? And if someone refers to me as a member of that committee for approval, then it assumes that as an elected member, I have some choice. And I do not want to frustrate this. Absolutely do not want to frustrate this. And I'm sure that if it had come 2 months ago, I strongly suspect my vote would have been exactly what it's going to be today. But it seems to me that if you go to your shareholder, the shareholder, in other words, you come to council seeking approval, that it does imply that it's not just a formality and a rubber stamp. So
Yes.
the question I'm asking you is, what would have been a better process that we're now in effect more or less retrospectively ticking off something that's already happened?
I think it's the same response I gave Councillor McPherson to a similar question. At the earliest possible time, we should have identified that this was a major transaction, and at that point in time set in place a course of action to ensure it came through to the Finance Committee in a timely fashion to ensure it was approved.
If we were inclined not to, and I'm not wanting to split straws and hairs, because obviously we're not, but what would be the consequences if we exercised the judgment and said no today?
I think it's a question probably better put to the Chief Executive of...
Well, that's fine, because you see, I don't want to be rubber stamped, so I just want to know, before I do rubber stamp this, what would have been the consequences if I decided not to?
It was more of a question for our legal support.
Yeah, if we had identified it obviously as a major transaction, we would have brought it forward when we were doing our statement of intent. There has never been any issue about it not being disclosed to council. It's always been there, put in front of council. So, I apologise, I didn't find it earlier. But the consequences are that we're presently, as the thing says, we're presently constructing. We haven't signed the documents loan for the Bank of New Zealand obviously, because that depends on your resolution. I'm not too sure what the end game would be. We obviously have in a contract with Hawkins for a design and build, and that's been declared.
Just as a query, because I think this is an issue for this council, not the company, but looking back, is there something that the company might have done better just to have actually really got the advice beyond question, and that would have been communicated to the shareholder?
Yeah, I'm sure in retrospect I can look back, there might have been some point of intervention if I'd looked deep into the shareholders agreement and discovered that, or had asked somebody deep in the shareholders agreement. But at that stage, I'm fully familiar, in business working with the Companies Act, and was quite comfortable it wasn't a major transaction. But as it turns out, I was wrong.
But to have from your point of view, surely to have a last minute come here to council is not an ideal process.
Not how I run businesses.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Martin. You?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions, in fact, to yourself as Chairman and to Sean. I'm assuming you're both very familiar with the shareholders' agreement.
Possibly yes and no. No, not overly familiar with it, no.
The reason I ask, because from what I can glean, you made some initial decisions.
Assumptions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, assumptions and as such decisions. I'm assuming you took the time to read the shareholders' agreement before you made those decisions.
No. Just to be clear...
So Sean, did you?
Yes, if I could just respond from my perspective. I have read the shareholders' agreement previously, but it was quite some time ago, and at the time when Whipple made it known to us through the SOR, and well before that in terms of their arrangement with Tetra Pak, I simply did not think to refer back to the shareholder agreement and check that clause for materiality, and I should have, and I acknowledge that.
Just a quick question to the Chief Executive, because I understood you to say that, in fact, in an ideal sense, that staff that aren't currently in a particular job role would have picked this up. My question to you is, would you assume a member of your senior management would have taken the time to read the shareholders' agreement in light of the fact that he's about to make a critical decision or recommendation?
I think the senior manager should be familiar with the shareholders' agreement, as Sean said he was, just not on the specific calculations. I think the process that should, and now listening to this conversation, what should have happened is with the statement of intent when it came out, we should have reviewed it for indication of a major transaction, and at that point reviewed it against the criteria of the shareholders' agreement, actually a regimented approach to ensure that because we can't rely on people's memories, what we've got to rely on is a structured process, so that's what needs to be in place going forward.
And I guess I raised that in the context that I was never particularly happy with the structure of the delegated authorities. However, the will of council has chosen to let that unfold, and then I'm simply now raising a scenario where both the committee chair and a critical member of the senior executive who gave advice chose for, didn't refer back to the foundation document, and that decisions were beginning to unfold without that proper reference, and that we were just in good judgment, as Councillor Mallett will let us to believe, that the competent staff in democracy chose to refer to the foundation document and actually gave the proper advice.
Just to be clear,
I just need confirmation that nothing that I've just said is inaccurate, Richard.
I think that fairly reflects. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Okay.
just to be clear, you asked me, and perhaps I used the wrong word, I used the word assumptions. In actual fact, my email of the 29th of June was a email asking questions for advice, and that advice was asking from Sean and from Democracy. So no decisions were made from that email, and it was only when I got what I thought to be valid, and upon seeing the reasoning behind the decision was totally appropriate advice from Democracy, that we set and train the process of this this meeting.
Interestingly, it was also then consistent with the legal advice that the company, of which we're the shareholder, also had. Because
I'd be surprised if it wasn't.
Well, that was, well, my point is one would have assumed the latter occurred first. So one would have assumed that the company was well aware of the requirement that this was a significant or a major transaction. I mean, what we heard today
explained, I think Stuart's explained that matter in terms of the Companies Act definition versus the shareholders agreement.
No. Their legal advice was very accurate. They defined that there were two triggers. One, which is under the Companies Act, that you and I would be very familiar with, that doesn't trigger, but actually under the shareholders agreement it does, and they picked that up.
Yeah, and I think they alerted that to us in the 18th of June in this. So I don't see any fault there.
No, well, certainly no fault on either their actions or the inactions of those giving the advice. Yeah. I'm just simply saying that I'm somewhat still astonished that it took us so long to catch up with what was appropriate.
I think as soon as we found out, we scuttled around all over the place. Yeah. I don't think anyone sat on information without acting on it very quickly.
No, but they clearly, it looks like they didn't interpret the advice that they should have. And I guess in hindsight, you would probably take the time to read the shareholders agreement, and so would Sean, before suggesting a course of action. I'm assuming that's the learning from the process.
Look, if I may, and I don't want to belabor the issue, look, there are two decision points here. That first of all was as soon as we got understanding that it was a material transaction and so forth, absolutely we agreed with that in terms of getting that. The second decision, when I gave my thoughts or my opinion back to say that I felt that that I assumed that the approval of the statement of intent was sufficient in itself to be a resolution for, of council, accepting the arrangement that Waikato Innovation Park was acceptable and so forth. That was the second point, not the question over the materiality, because it was crystal clear in the advice that came through from Tompkins Wake via Waikato Innovation Park. So the second was an error of judgment on my point, thinking that the SOI approval constituted an approval as a knock-on of the actual arrangement.
And you'll see that on point 4 of my email of 29, where I say, where I asked whether or not our approval of the SOI met the threshold of major transaction. That was one of the things we asked Brendan to give us advice on. Angela.
Just a quick question, actually. Can you tell me what's the term of the lease with Tetra Pak?
I've got a confidential agreement to lease.
Okay.
I'm very reluctant, Mr Chairman, to disclose the terms of the lease.
You can't give me the
I think
5 by 5 by 5, 10 by 10. I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of.
No, I think
Can't give me
that's
that.
one of the things. A lot of this, like the value of the loan, the value of the building, is
I think that's the
public.
criteria. The bank wouldn't, they've gone through those terms and the type of tenant that's there and are quite happy, obviously, to loan on that. It gives you some idea of the strength of the lease.
That's fine. That's enough, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions or comment? Yes, Gordon?
I'm just going to signal that I'm prepared to move the recommendation and add, if you approve, an additional sentence. So when you're ready.
Yep, I'm happy to. Okay, we move that, and what's your additional
Well,
sentence?
the additional sentence would be your point 7, which is that no underwriting or guarantee of the BNZ loan is offered or implied by HCC. Just spells out very clearly.
I think that's totally appropriate.
Up to you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to second that.
Mr Chair, I've just got a question as well, if I could, on since we're now being asked to, as the shareholder, sign off on this from a shareholder's standpoint, I have a question to the company. And the question is, did you pursue other lending institutions? Why did you choose the Bank of New Zealand? Did you do a comparative study in terms of other lending providers?
We did a book study of other providers. They have backed us for the last, it must be well before I've been here, the BNZ, and have been very flexible around covenants and that sort of thing. Very flexible, considering there's no guarantees or underwrites for shareholders, which is can be an issue. So no, I didn't seek other tenders, but I was fully aware of what the marketplace was, because I operate in that marketplace and looked at other alternatives and said those were competitive numbers, competitive terms that they came to. So I was quite happy with it.
Okay, is there any debate on the motion, Martin?
Have you had a second?
I second it. Martin?
Yes. First of all, I commend the initiatives you took, Mr Chair, as Chair of the CCO, in terms of the key questions you asked and you addressed. And I absolutely commend the democracy team and the skill base within the democracy team for the advice that they gave. What I don't like about this is it does very much remind me as a 5-minute to midnight under urgency retrospective legislation to sign and seal and approve something which in essence, in reality, we have no option but to rubber stamp. And in an ideal world, I have to say, and I cannot believe that this did not come to us much, much sooner, and not certainly as an urgent last minute item. Before we say council is, noting that there's no underwrite or guarantee implied by the HCC. Yes, that is correct. But if you're a 100% shareholder of a company, one implies it is still part of your stable. And it does imply that ultimately, as Harry Truman would once say, the buck stops here. The buck stops here because we are the parent company. This does highlight for me, and let me acknowledge, the CCO does good work, and I can go and have a say if I choose to find out when the meetings are and all of that, and I've never been stopped. I acknowledge that. What I remain offended by personally, and I accept that in a democracy the majority of this council apparently approves that, I am denied as a democratically elected member, along with the majority of councillors, the right to have any say, i.e. with a vote, in that statement of intent, let alone appointment of directors. I believe that if that did come back here, you guys would still do the bulk of the work, but it's a check and balance from my point of view, and I think that's personally very bad governance. I think today we've seen an example of very bad governance that, by good fortune, a question was referred via the democracy team, and not by good fortune, by good design, the democracy team has some people of very high capacity, and I thank Jude for that. But you have to say it shouldn't just have relied necessarily on the democracy team for that to have happened. And one is minded that I think, frankly, on this we have egg all over our faces in terms of good government and good governance and good management. We have egg all over our faces because this is not how a major corporate would act. A major competent corporate would not have a 1 minute to midnight rubber stamp deal. This would have come to us in process, normal, etc., etc. However, let me compliment you on your work and your team, but I think you in this case have been very ill served, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Your Worship.
I support the motion, and I'm very pleased to see that what is colloquially known as Innovation Park continues to develop, because the council and therefore the city's investment in Innovation Park has been a long time in the waiting, we would say. And over the last 3 or 4 years, it has started to perform in a way which I think originally the investor, the council and others, thought it would. So I want to thank the company for that. Tetra Pak is an international company. It bases its headquarters here in Hamilton. It is an outstanding business. We have been well aware of their desire to expand their footprint at Innovation Park for some time, several years. And in fact, I think when we had our induction tour, we stopped off at Innovation Park and we talked about Tetra Pak's desire to expand because their business was expanding. So, I mean, as an investment, it's a good one. Finally, Innovation Park is starting to perform in a way that the city had hoped for when it initially set it up. So I think it's a good investment, and I'm pleased that they're getting on with it. In relation to the process, I am very, very annoyed at what's happened here. I think it is behoved on the company to know and understand the process and to understand the terms of the shareholder agreement. It is their responsibility to check these things and bring it to the shareholder when required. And I think this has been entirely unsatisfactory. And sadly, that detracts from an excellent investment in Innovation Park that is a great investment for our city, region, and actually for New Zealand. I'm pleased to hear the Chief Executive say that he intends to check and recheck the processes that are in place for these things. One of the disadvantages of having bespoke agreements that we have with all of our CCOs is each one of them is different. And in fact adds another layer of checks and balances beyond the legislation. That's good in some respects, but causes confusion in others, as we've heard today. The Companies Act said it's not a major transaction, but our shareholders' agreement says something different, a tougher test, if you like. So, yes, Chief Executive, I do expect that you have in place a proper process so that we can check and double check these things. But at the end of the day, it is the company's responsibility to know their documents, to know their arrangements, and to bring things to us in the appropriate manner. But apart from that, this is a good investment. And I'm very pleased that it's expanding the footprint in Innovation Park, because that's a success story. And we need to start shouting that a bit louder. Thank you.
Thanks, Your Worship. Dave?
Yes, I agree with the Mayor to a certain extent on the process and the problems with it. But what I would add to that is it's not a one-sided responsibility, just the company. I believe it's the council that is equally responsible, especially when this is a not just a council-controlled company, but 100% owned company by this council. We should be all over those sorts of agreements. As has been said in here, it's not exactly rocket science. It was very black and white. I think you said that yourself as chair, what the requirements were in this case. And while, yes, the company should have known it, and I would expect them to, so should our management have known it, and I would expect them to have things in place. Notwithstanding the fact that someone may not be in a particular job, we may be waiting between employees, we still should have good records of things like this, and it has happened, these problems, several times in the recent past in this area where we interface with the commercial world. I don't think that we are all over those relationships and those agreements and the processes we're supposed to be following. Where I disagree with the Mayor, actually it's not about Tetra Pak, totally agree with her comments about them as a company, but when I first started council, Innovation Park, as it's commonly called, was set up more as an incubator for businesses to develop in the area of agri-science and related areas like that. It wasn't actually set up to be a commercial landlord as it's turning into. I can understand why Whipple wants to go down there. That's far more secure, I suppose, sustainable. It's quite difficult, helping incubate a lot of small businesses in that area, startups and so forth. That's what I think it was set up to do. That's what it was sold to the public. I believe that's why the government gave, I think, 2 tranches of a couple of $1 million each for that sort of purpose, not so that we could build a $9 million building or that that company that we own could build one for another commercial company. I think that could have been done from elsewhere in the commercial community.
Thank you. Ewan?
Yeah, look, just some brief comments. First of all, I think the Mayor is right when she says that the deal itself is a good deal for Hamilton Inc. In terms of both the tenant and the lessor. I think it's a good deal. But I think my frustration reflects, like I think most of you, on the process, and I think this reflects this paradigm shift, where in the good old days, actually, we would have elected members on Waikato Innovation Park. In fact, I was there in my early days as an elected member, and the paradigm shift was, look, elected members have very little to contribute, let's retrench, let's bring it all back, let's have these CCOs at a distance, let's have a lot of this decision-making in small delegated groups. And I think we've simply reaped what we've sown. The chickens have all flown back, and there is this breakdown that you have the likes of Innovation Park not understanding its obligations to its shareholders. And you have us not fully understanding our obligations to the companies of which we hold shares in. And I think that's where it's disappointing, and I think the Mayor has articulated that as well. And I guess we can just be very glad that we have a robust team in democracy who, when asked, and I think Councillor Mallett made the right decision, asking them for an opinion, because when they were asked, they performed well. But I think it reflects generally a change in tact, and one of the flaws that a lot of us had raised in the past when we decided to embrace this model, that these things are held at a distance. We do that with the airport, and we do that with Innovation Park, and this is the byproduct of that positioning, in my opinion.
Thank you. Margaret?
I just want to provide some context here. I mean, one oversight doesn't mean to say that the whole system is a wreck. I think we have a number of CCOs and a number of entities that council either runs or owns that actually, or has as a shareholder, that actually work very well for most of the time, or for all of the time. And here we're faced with one example, and you know, look, I don't care what sort of governance structure, what sort of setup you have, we are human, and people are going to make mistakes from time to time. Thankfully, I don't think we have egg on our face in this situation. We still have the ability to move forward, and we still have the ability to have a really great outcome for the city. So you just keep some context here, and as I mentioned earlier, every councillor around this table has had the ability to decide whether delegations and delegated authorities were the way to go, and I haven't seen who voted which, but it obviously went through. So my assumption is that a number of councillors around this table approved the delegated authorities and delegations.
Thank you. I'll just say a few words. Firstly, I just want to...
Not me.
I beg your pardon, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm just just let it be clear, as you recall, on the delegation,
Sorry,
I questioned at the
your
time. I'm sorry, but that's a point of debate. It's probably not a point of order, Mr Chair. I did not approve that delegation around the CCO, but in raising a point of order, I realised I withdraw the point of order. I was raising a point of order in that I strongly opposed it at the time, but I realised that's probably a point of debate and not a point of order.
Okay, thank you, sorry.
I didn't realise it was a point of order, sorry.
Okay. Look, thank you, everyone. Just putting some context in, as Margaret has, the decision by Whipple to build the Tetra Pak building has been flagged to the council for 2 years now through the CCO committee. The quantities involved, the values involved have all been flagged to us. So this now came down, so the substance was not challenged. The issue here was a matter of process. Unfortunately, there was some cloudiness over that process. I just want to thank everyone involved, particularly the Democracy Committee, but the members of the council, Angela as well, for allowing us to have half an hour before her meeting, and now we've gone half an hour into her meeting. But all councillors for accepting that what this was an error in process, not an error in substance, and some very, very good points have been raised today, which I hope we can make some learnings from, to use the trendy new word. But I think we've ended up with the solution that we should have got, and that's all I'll say before I ruin it. Okay, we'll vote now. Those in favour of the recommendation, or everyone, please. Go to the board. Yeah.
We've just used hands.
Is the board not on?
No, Mr Chairman, we don't use the board for committees, unfortunately.
Okay, so we'll just... Okay, those in favour, please raise your hands. Those against?
Carried unanimously.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
you.